PS2.
PSU power supply.
Oh.
Yes, PS2. That's exactly what he meant.
Yeah, dude, you got to get in the retro gaming gig.
Well,
Uh,
there'll be plenty of Black Friday sales to disappoint, so you can buy one of them.
They revived the PS1 in a weird form factor thing, I remember, about 2 years ago. I don't
don't
think it
recall
runs
seeing that.
discs. Yeah, I think it ran digital games somehow. It was a weird. I mean, it still exists. It's
Was
just a
it
weird thing.
Sony that did that, or was it somebody else?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, Sony is normally extremely punitive when it comes to anybody trying to
Sony and
do
Nintendo
anything
both did that
basically with their
with
stuff.
like replica miniature old consoles that had retro games installed on them or something.
Oh, I do remember that.
I'm just not that interested in retro games, so I didn't look too deeply into it.
I'm a bit of a graphics snob, so really dated games definitely kind of suck a bit of the excitement out. With a few exceptions, there are definitely some that like I'm more than willing to overlook. GoldenEye is a good example. I'll play that, except for not on the controller. On
GoldenEye
the
is such a bad example of like the graphics in that were horrid.
Yeah, they were, but I do love that game.
Yeah,
And the Halo, like the old Halo games, like they definitely look a bit dated for sure, but they're still playable. Anyways,
yeah.
all right, we are live. Welcome to Troglodyte Radio Podcast. We're doing hot takes number 6. I think we'll just leap right into it. Hubbards, do you want to kick us off with your first hot take?
I suppose. So my first thing was just that in Canada, well, I guess in North America in general, it seems like, especially online, you get a lot of like circle jerking about how Canada is like clearly superior to the US for our healthcare because, you'll see a story about like some American going bankrupt from healthcare and then they'll be like, "Oh, if only they lived in Canada, ha ha, they would be perfect."
Then they would have died from lack of medical attention.
Well, yeah, and that's my take is like Canada's healthcare system is probably as bad, if not worse, than the American. And it just, I would say that if you put it into like context, the American system is not great, but the Canadian system is also just heaping dog shit. So, it's not fair to like make the American
There's
system
shit
seem.
in different ways, is what you're saying?
Yeah, that like there's some overlap in the shit, I assume, but like yeah, the shittiness comes in different forms. And I think like if you were to look at any like if you were to make a comparison to a good system, you'd have to go to Europe or somewhere else that actually does a decent job of healthcare rather than Canada. And I think actually another one, I'm not nearly as familiar, but the UK is also shit. So I think like you got like the trifecta of garbage healthcare systems with those three countries, and none of them, like nobody in those three countries should be smug about their system. Should just be embarrassed and sad that the healthcare systems exist the way they do in any of the countries. Like the US, obviously, you have the problem of insurance, which is just if you're not insured, you can go bankrupt. That's obviously a huge problem. And then two, it's like a bureaucratic nightmare to get like your claims covered, and like sometimes you have to like go to this hospital because it's in network or whatever. I'm not American, so I haven't had to deal with it, but I've read enough stories about it, and I can just imagine like the bureaucracy being very annoying and irritating to deal with because of insurance companies. And so that's like a pretty obvious negative. And then if you look at like you add like insurance just means that healthcare costs a lot in the US. But if you compare it to Canada, Canada actually doesn't. We have like the second highest per capita spending on healthcare in like the developed world.
From what I've seen for graphics, infographics with bar graphs, Canada's is high, like relative to everyone else, but it's in the same sort of ballpark as most other countries with socialized healthcare. But America's is just an outlier. They spend so much money on healthcare per capita that it's wild.
Yeah, well, that's true, but there's I guess there's two things there. Yeah, so Canada's is still expensive. Like it's more expensive than other countries with socialized medicine,
Yeah.
even though it's not yeah, it's not as outrageous as the U.S. But it's not like we're running a lean mean machine that's like on the cheaper end. It's the highest in other than the U.S. And then the other thing is like the U.S. Some of like at least part of the explanation for them having the most expensive is that they have the best R&D. Just it's not even a question. Like they have
Mhm.
the best. They're the ones innovating on cancer survival rates because they come up with the new treatments, they come up with the new drugs, they come up with the better equipment. Like the Americans actually get something for their money.
One thing
And
I had to look up recently in a debate I was having about American healthcare is that it's 92% of Americans have health insurance, because people think that for some reason most Americans don't have health insurance, or if you're not working, you're not insured. But it's really if you're not old, if you're not young, if you're not poor, and you're not working, that you're not insured. So that leaves about 8% of the population.
and then even then you have like the option. Well, I guess yeah, you have the option to get relatively affordable insurance through Obamacare in the
Yeah.
US if you're not if even if you don't meet any of those criteria, right? And it's like it's relatively affordable. It's still like a few $100s a month and then you have deductibles and stuff, but it's like it's it's exaggerated, I would say, the degree to which American healthcare.
Well, look how much less tax Americans pay. I'm sure it evens out with paying for having to pay for healthcare, even if you somehow weren't working. I guess if you're not working, you're not paying tax on your income, so it is rough. But like it does seem to mostly apply to college students because they're like the middle class that's not working and doesn't have money.
Well, but a lot of colleges offer like cheap healthcare through the schools in America, I'm pretty sure. And you can also get
Oh yeah, that makes
it's like
sense.
Canada as well, where you can get cheap insurance through your parents' plans. Like, so if
Mm.
your parents are working and you're in school, like most middle class families are just gonna have their children insured, right? Like until they're graduated and have their own job. So it's like, again, like there's options there. It's not like everyone's running around. Like, yeah, it's not like half the population runs around with no coverage. But again, going back to like Canada, it's in Canada because it's quote unquote free. There's no like cost for primary care. Then the demand is basically unlimited. The supply obviously is limited. So then what do you get? You get shortages and rationing. It's an inevitability when you have demand
Mm.
outstripping supply. And of course, our government is so useless that they haven't instituted any sort of like mitigating mechanisms to keep demand at reasonable levels. So they just leave it up to like self policing through inconvenience and wait times. So it's like in order to like damp down demand, they just let the wait times build up such that to get any sort of healthcare, you need to wait in line for 6 hours at like critical care or whatever. And you have like any rational person has to be literally on death's door before they consider to going to a hospital in Canada because it's the most miserable experience you can have as a Canadian is to go to hospital. You have to wait hours and hours and hours, even if you're in tremendous pain and discomfort, just sit in the waiting room unless you're actually like coding out and fucking crumbled on the floor dead. You won't
Another
get treatment.
problem with Canadian healthcare that exacerbates that problem is a lack of family doctors. So that a bunch of people who don't have a family doctor just basically use the emergency room as their primary care. Like they don't have any pressing issue, but they go to emergency because that's the only place they know where to go because they don't have a family doctor.
Well, and that's like it all pushes down, right? Part of the reason they don't have a family doctor is because family doctors are getting slammed with their like with a small number of patients because patients will show up for everything, right? Oh, you have a little snivel, time to show up to the doctor. Because there's no cost, there's no disincentive.
Hmm.
The
And there's
only
no reason for the doctors not to take them because they get to charge every one of those visits equally to the government. So really, for them, doing a bunch of sniffle visits is very lucrative.
it's ideal, right? And so it's just there's all the incentives in the Canadian system are just to like make it so the people with like the least amount of the lowest opportunity cost is clog up the healthcare system because they're the only ones willing to wait 6 hours. Like if you have a job, if you're a normal employed person, it's like, oh, I have to take a full day off of work to go to a doctor because I have to wake up at 5 a.m. to get to the clinic to wait in line. Unless you're one of the lucky persons that has a family doctor, and even then, you might have to book months in advance. It's like, wow, that's really nice to know that my medical issues will be, known months in advance. It's like, no, they're not.
Yeah,
They're usually
I
going
have
to
a
come up,
couple.
and then,
Sorry, go ahead.
well, it's just like because of the way it works. It's like normally your health issues come up, and then in Canada, you have to wait 6 weeks while you book an appointment to actually get the issue looked at.
Yeah, I have a
Because
couple examples for this too. Like I had to go to a specialist, and it was going to take 6 months to get in to see them. It's like, this is crazy. Like it took weeks to get in to see the doctor, and then he said, okay, you got to go to a specialist, and that specialist is booked up for 6 months. And I had like somebody I know in my own network, the father was waiting for 2 years to get a surgery, and he was in a great deal of pain, and the surgery was required to like at least alleviate that pain, hopefully eliminate it. But they kept canceling on him, so he'd fly down to the area, like to the bigger city, to get the and he'd have to, all at his own expense, he'd have to fly down to the city, stay overnight, hopefully go into surgery the next morning, and then they'd cancel it. Like, oh, it got too busy. And that happened for 2 years. And I think he spent something like $3,000 because he'd have to book the hotel himself. He'd have to book all the flights. There was no compensation for any of that. And then
I think it's a tax write-off when you're traveling for medical, but I mean, a tax write-off isn't 100%.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
something.
Yeah, there is a bit of a benefit there in that sense, but he still had to shell out thousands of dollars for this, and they would cancel the morning of his surgery. Twice it was canceled. They're like, oh, we don't have the time and space for it. Sorry. It's like, and it took 2 years of him sitting in bad pain to get that resolved. It's like imagine that, like having like a horrible back problem for 2 years that they could have fixed, but you have to basically spend $3,000 to finally get it done and deal with the pain for that length of time. So I think a lot of people, they're ignorant of how bad it can actually be.
When you get a lot of cases of medical tourism from Canada for problems that aren't deemed serious enough to be addressed in a timely fashion, or for problems that aren't covered by our socialized healthcare.
Yeah,
so
I know
dental's the biggest one, like dental to Mexico, because dental in Canada is just incredibly expensive because it's not socialized. And then any like minor issues that you're going to be on a waiting list for 6 months, you could just go to America or Mexico, probably Mexico, honestly, and get it fixed. Like
I know some people have gone to the Netherlands.
That's probably a fairly specific surgery if you have to go to the Netherlands, so wouldn't it be? Because it was
a more specific one, but the wait times in Canada were going to be so bad that they just went there.
I've heard of people going to Germany because they don't even offer certain surgeries in Canada.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, all those issues combined, I think like the end of the day, it's like, especially for like people, that can't just leave the country, go to the States to get like, if you're very wealthy, then Canada's healthcare system isn't a big deal because you
don't use it.
you don't have to use it for the things that you don't like that are inconvenient. Like as soon as you run into a roadblock, you're just like, okay, I'm going down to the States and getting the best. And it's like for your day to day, okay, fine, I can use it. And if you get shot and need to go to the hospital, Canadian healthcare system is pretty good, like in that analysis. But it's like, it's if you have anything that's like not life threatening, but just like quality of life type stuff that you actually want to get, and like forget like proactive preventative medicine, like getting your blood checked. Like I know there's a lot of like advancement advancements in the area of like monitoring different blood markers and all that kind of thing to like identify health trends and all this stuff. It's like the Canadian system, because it's socialized, will never use that in like ever, because
In
it's just
BC, you can get private lab results, but you have to get them ordered by a doctor to make them like they're partially covered. And then because I did a blood test a while ago, but it depends on what you're doing in that blood test, how much it's covered. But you can get them ordered from a private lab by your doctor, and then a bunch of the stuff is mitigated or covered.
yeah, but like I mean, usually for those types of things, there has to be a medical like a medical issue that they prescribe the blood test for. They have to write you a lab
With
requisition.
my family doctor, you just say you feel like you need a blood test, and she just asked like what I wanted tested, and I wanted like iron and hormone levels, or it's a hormone, whatever your thyroid test and iron. So she just wrote those two for me. Like it was fairly straightforward. It might not be what they're supposed to do.
Hubbard's is saying
That's
more
how
like
my
a full
family doctor
panel,
did it.
like a full panel test for all sorts of markers, and I could see it like the Canadian system not doing like not wanting to pay, like, cover that or even allow you to go to a
Well,
private clinic.
I'm just you can get that privately tested. It's just never going to be done through the Canadian healthcare system, because they'd have to offer it to everyone, right? So it's like all these different proactive resources that you could be utilizing or having used for your health are just, you're going to have to pay out of pocket, and you're probably going to have to go somewhere like potentially out of country to places to say like the US, where they actually have the infrastructure in place, because they're not so militant about fighting against private health providers. Like there's just so much roadblocks in the way of setting up private practice in Canada, that there's just not the same level of service for all these like new healthcare advances that are coming out.
I think the ones that would be the toughest to deal with that I've heard of are when you get a probable diagnosis of cancer, but then your follow-up tests are months away. And then once they confirm the cancer after months, then it's months away until you get surgery. It's like the cancer is literally growing inside your body as you wait for the surgery to remove it. It's like, it'd be awful. So lots of people who can afford it go to the US or Mexico to try and get better cancer treatment for sure.
Yeah, so I think, just to summarize, unless you guys have something else, the Canadian system to me is just very mediocre, and probably on par with America's for just trade-offs and just generalized inefficiencies and poor quality. And Canadians should just have some humility and maybe start looking around to countries that are actually considered to be leaders in healthcare. Like I know for a fact, like Germany and Sweden are often held up as having much stronger healthcare systems than us, and maybe we should take some tips and tricks from them and not just be so complacent just because we're better than the US, or perceive ourselves as being better than the US.
As often happens in Canada. Just, we're better than the US, pat ourselves on the back. We're in 29th place, they're in 30th.
Basically, exactly. It's like, we came second last. Good enough, boys. Pack her up.
If you're not last, you're first. That's what my daddy always told me.
Yeah,
so
I don't have anything more to add, but yeah, that's good.
Okay, I'll come in here with the next one. I think that all this AI art that I'm sure everyone's heard of by now, because it's really made it into the mainstream news. The AI art, and then to a lesser extent, the AI writing, although its ability to write is, I would say, worse than its ability to create art, it seems at the moment. But I think it's just an all-around good thing. And the arguments against it that I see are really what convinces me the most, that there's not a good argument against it, because if there was, I think people would be parroting it. But it's almost always just basically, Oh, there's just a different type of feeling and emotion that you get from human art instead of AI art when you're looking at it on a digital screen being transmitted to you digitally. It's just like you can't really replace the human soul in the artwork. And I think that ship sailed a long time ago. And actually, that I was watching some philosophy to brush up on. I know Walter Benjamin, or Walter Benjamin, if you're English, it did a lot of work on that in the 30s, or at least a book on it that's fairly comprehensive. And he talked about how the reproducibility of art was destroying the aura that art had. And I think aura is an easy thing to describe. It's the best way I saw it as an example is the difference between seeing a picture of a mountain and being in the forest looking at a mountain. Like that's where you're getting the full force of the aura. And obviously art is going to have various degrees, but that once it's reproducible, that aura is really quite diminished from sort of a one-off, this is the only place you can see it aspect. That's what he was talking about in the 30s, especially with regards to photography and film. And in film, he talked about how it was a collective production of a lot of people working together. And in a sense, it wasn't even art in the traditional sense because it didn't have that aura intrinsically. Although people attempt to capture that aura by basically the parasocial relationship you form with the actors as opposed to the art itself. So that digression to say that, in a sense, I think AI is almost a collaborative effort. It's like a tool that has been produced by engineers and software engineers and developers, and then is being used by artists in a way to create art that I don't think is really that much of a departure from any other improvement in tools, especially the digital. Like once digital came along and you could just draw your art in Iceland and put it on Twitter and people could be viewing it in Madagascar. Like that was an enormous phase change for the aura aspect. It's like your art is decontextualized, I think would be the right word. And this is really going, like it just takes the same idea further in the digital sense. So I think that digression might have been entirely unnecessary, but I basically think that it's going to be a very useful tool for artists to lower their workload. Like for the pro stance, rather than now that I've debunked the soul stuff, why do you need to spend 10,000 hours training your hand to draw what you have pictured in your mind if you can get a good approximation of that in a couple of minutes through an AI and then finish off polishing it up by hand yourself afterwards?
Well, and I would just go, I more or less agree, and I would just go further and like you don't even need like basically any human, how would I say, like human technical input. Like I think it'll just like all this AI art stuff will just allow like what the human is, what variable is being input by the human to change, right? Like,
yeah, well, that'd be ideal. Like, imagine if they could Neuralink into your brain, and what you actually visualize in your brain could be then output by the AI. Like, turn your visualization into art. Like, you literally could not shit on that. That is like the perfect expression of what you're thinking. You're not being held back by the medium.
And that's one example.
Like, I do think that through like a process like art, while I actually agree with what you're saying, especially with the Neuralink, I do think that there's something to be said about just when you're producing artwork, like you don't really know even what you're doing. Like you just start sketching something and something forms. You weren't really thinking, you didn't have something pictured in your mind, crisp and clear, and then you just brought it to life on the paper. I think a lot of it happens through just exploration. But I do think that that can also be accomplished with just toying around with the AI, right? Like you try a combination of words. It's like, that came out with something interesting. Now, okay, let's do this next word. Okay, I'll put that in. Oh, and then it just keeps going from there. So I do think that there is still some value of like just sketching around, but I do think that that could even be like that same process, that artistic process, is completely doable within the AI systems. Like you can recreate that there, but like I just wanted to get back against the idea that like, you know, you're gonna have a clear image in your head and then you just want to translate that directly onto paper, even though I'm sure some artists they do it that way.
I think that's even a bigger argument for what Price was saying, in the sense like you will give your impression, and then the computer will generate something, and then you'll observe that generation and then
Keep
alter it
tweaking it.
based on
Yeah.
like, yeah, like, and that's like it's, you know, in that sense the AI is like a paintbrush or anything other tool of art, and you're still the person inputting you're still the one
Yeah.
creating. And I think the other thing is like it'll just mean that people are like, I think like artists will shift more. I think this has happened over time in various things. Like it'll allow for people to shift more like being narrators and story creators than like technical artists. Like a huge amount of quote unquote artists are employed in like movie production for computer generated graphic stuff for like Marvel movies and stuff.
They're not the
And
ones telling the story.
well, and it's just like that's, I mean, they do create impressive landscapes and stuff, but I don't think most people would say like, oh, that's like some high form of art. And I think like putting like just being able to shift that burden to computers will allow like a more freeing up of creative talent to go to other things. Like I don't think it'll like, I think it'll just move where people express themselves artistically. Like it'll just allow for an expansion of artistic expression, and like maybe other people who never had the ability to say paint well because they just didn't have the fine motor skills could narrate a painting that's very beautiful by telling the computer what they want to see on the canvas. That what they tell the computer to generate is very artistic and unique, and they would have never been able to do that because they don't have the ability to paint. And it's not like just because AI exists that traditional painters can't exist right alongside them. It just expands opportunities.
I want to
Yeah,
just
I
like
agree
build
with
on that
that.
a little, because that's kind of the thread I started with, and then I went off on a tangent when I looked up the arguments against AI art, and I was just flabbergasted by them. But in a way, it almost boils down to like what the people consider being an artist, and it seems like a lot of laymen consider being an artist to be like doing the menial work, like the CGI work for a film, where you're one of 1,000 people working on 10,000 frames of the movie to make it all look right. But I mean, the interesting part of being an artist is the creative aspect, and that's the thing that like AI, obviously, it can do things differently than you're envisioning right now. But in a perfect world, you're capable of getting the AI to do what you want it to do, and you're supplying the creative input, and that's ideal. Like that is the difficult part of art, is being creative and inventive and original. And if AI can facilitate that easier, like it's just a net gain. It's not like some people act like everyone's just going to whip out AI art and start producing it, and it's just going to degrade art as a whole. And it's like right now, most of the people using those AI things in that fashion are pumping out relative garbage, and they're just going to stop using it in a month. Like they're not accomplishing anything with it, or they'll get better, like if they have the actual talent and interest. But right now it's a fad, and when that fad fades, I think you'll see mostly like real artists utilizing the strengths of it.
Yeah, I could definitely see that too. Well, it's just like YouTube and whatnot, and podcasts like ours. There's just going to be, when you lower that bar, there's going to be a huge wave of people incoming, and then they just get bored and move on.
Or they aren't talented at it.
Yeah,
so
and
they
they
don't
get
the
no
positive
they get,
reinforcement.
yeah,
and then
exactly.
they just move to something that's more
attention.
reinforced. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you just quit.
But the blowback against it, it definitely hit something on a deep level for a lot of people. Because especially the fact that they all describe it as AI art, not someone using AI to make art. It's like you don't describe a painting as paintbrush art. Like you don't describe a drawing as pencil
I
art.
think
Well,
it's
maybe you do.
I think it's like
Pencil art's kind of a thing.
it's a
But
Luddite reaction.
yeah, exactly. That's a
That's
good
what
way
it
of putting it
is.
because it's going to put out a bunch of. It's actually very accurate because the Luddites didn't like the machines that made the job more efficient and lost workers' jobs. And I mean, in a sense, this is the beginning of leading down the path of removing a bunch of menial art
Yeah,
jobs
and
from the world.
I think that's the reaction. Is I think a lot of people are starting to come to realize that their jobs are actually at risk now. Not right.
And those people are going to be happier without those jobs. So let's be honest, like sitting there and editing CGI screens for the latest Transformers, I don't think that's anybody's
You mean
ideal.
latest Marvel? Transformers dead.
Dude, I don't know. I don't follow these trends. I'm not one of these
I was gonna
Zoomers.
say you're stuck in 2013.
Oh, that was about
You're
the
a
last
little
time I cared
bit.
about
You're
movies.
a little bit behind
So-
the times.
That Megan Fox, she's sure smoking.
Throwback. Even when I was watching, she had fallen off.
Do you guys have anything more to throw on that one?
Nope, I'm good. Um,
The only other thing I'll add, I guess, is a little digression about the text-based AI. And I could be totally off about this because it's just intuition, but I get such an uncanny valley feeling from a lot of posts on the internet these days that I'm assuming are made with GPT-3. That's the most up-to-date, free-to-use text-based software. And
like AI
it's like-
generated text-based
yeah, so
language, right?
yeah, and you can get the model and you can choose your own database to train it with to try and customize it for your needs. But it can pass a Turing test if there's no context. Like if you're just saying hi and then you're supposed to carry out a conversation with somebody you've never met before over the internet, it's hard to tell whether it's a bot or an AI or a human. But in context, there's so much uncanny valley stuff going on the internet that I attribute to bots at this point because humans have, unless Zoomers are just terrible and their introduction to the internet has ruined everything because they can't communicate as normal humans or read the room. But there's a lot of out of place shit that goes on that I just attribute to bots because I don't think they can understand context at all.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being the case. Bots are useful in terms of propaganda and waging war, so makes sense that they're going to be everywhere. All right, anything
Yeah,
else?
just astroturfing the internet.
Yeah, basically. Anything else, or do you want to move on?
As we'll move on.
All right, so the next one will be. I think I'll go with the plastic surgery one. So, basically, I think that plastic surgery gets a pretty bad rap and is actually pretty based. And just to clarify that, I don't mean like the ridiculous, double G tits and stuff like that, but whether we like it or not, looks are really important. And if you get dealt a really shitty deck and plastic surgery can help with that, I think it's actually like an extremely useful thing to do. And I'd kind of bring it back to an example. Like there was a girl I went to university with, and she was like, when I met her, she was very cute. And one of my friends was like, "Oh, holy shit, it's like so-and-so." And I guess he had gone to school with her in another country. And then he's like, she did not look like that in high school. And we actually wound up talking to her, and she had some pretty heavy duty plastic surgery done. And she actually showed us like before and after pictures, and it just like the difference is insane. Like she went from being extremely unattractive to actually like definitely above average. And I just think generally when we think of plastic surgery, it's just shit on pretty hard. Like, oh, you're just like the plastic Barbie bimbo. But I do think it has quite a bit of use, especially since if you're attractive, it actually confers a huge amount of benefits to you. That's just the sad reality, but that's how it goes. And so I think it's something that I think it's a good tool to be used so long as it's done well. Like if you're getting ridiculous things like huge arm implants and stuff like that, obviously that's not a useful way to go about it. But overall, anything to kind of lessen the bad deck of cards or bad hand of cards that you're dealt in terms of looks is, I think, just generally beneficial for a person.
I think I couldn't agree that it's based, because the based thing is
Maybe
getting
base is
getting jacked and learning to deal with your conditions. Like, fix what you can fix and then just get on with your life. But if you have enormous mental insecurities, or like if you're truly a 1 or 2 or 3 out of 10 and you're in good shape and you're still way below average, then it may be, in specific scenarios, it could be the right thing to do. But
yeah,
I
and
think
that's
for
kind of what I mean.
like,
It's like I think it is used misappropriately a lot of the time, and that is why it kind of does get a properly deserved bad rep. But I also think that it's a little bit overblown, because I have seen it with a couple of people where, you know, it actually has improved their life a lot. And I think that I just think it kind of got too much of a bad rap, and I think it's not a wrong thing. Basically, the underlying argument here is that, you know, you have that whole acceptance, you know, love yourself for who you are and all of that. And some of that is good. Like if you have been born with a certain issue that you're actually like never going to be able to fix, you do have to learn to live with it. But I think there's nothing wrong with wanting to improve some things that you can improve. I think it does go into some dark places where you just go crazy and obsess over it. And that has to obviously be dealt with so that you don't put yourself in a bad mental spot over things that you can't control or might even make worse. But I think generally it's not a bad thing to want to improve your looks. And if plastic surgery is one of those that can help out with that, I actually see nothing wrong with that.
Well, I don't know. I think like it's just, you say it gets a bad rap. It's because like what 99.98% of plastic surgery is just probably wasteful.
Frivolous, like huge lips and stuff like that.
Well, I just think about like there's a couple of like just specific examples of like trends, like the butt implant stuff is just awful.
That shit is ridiculous.
Like horrible. Like it's just one of the worst trends to happen in the last 20 years for
I've heard
human
of
eyes.
this on like the internet, but so this is a thing that actually happens.
I would say like I don't know how prevalent it is, but I'd say like honestly up to like 30 to 50% of like your classic female Instagram influencer has done some sort of butt surgery at this point. Like it's so crazy prevalent, and you can tell because a lot of them are really bad, and because it's like it was like just started to get popular and like developed in the last like 5 years. A lot of them were bad because the surgeons didn't know how to do them. I would say like honestly, there was like a learning curve there. So you like there's just so many examples of terrible ones, and honestly, it's just like even the ones that are quote unquote well done are just objectively, in my opinion, just like stupid. Like they don't add physical appeal. They just are weird and ghoulish looking. And then like the other example that I can think of that's just like emblematic of why plastic surgery is a scourge on society is like the whole Korean
stuff,
community.
No. Korea's, it's both genders. There's a ton of male plastic surgery too.
I guess that's like becoming more prevalent, for even the men. But like the women, like I don't even remember the stat, but it's like it's staggering how many, what percentage of Korean women get plastic surgery, and it's all to like the like model look is like extremely homogenous. So there's like all the Korean girls get this surgery to look exactly the same, and it's, I don't know, it's just awful. And the other thing, like to add to that, is like it becomes like a race to the bottom, right? It's like, you know, if you're 5 and you can get plastic surgery to look like a 6.5. Well, then the 6.5 is going to get plastic surgery to look like an 8, and the 8's going to get it to look like a 9, and 9's going to get it to look like a 10. And there's just like everyone is going to be forced to get it, because if they don't, then they're just left in the dust, and it just spirals out of control. It's like prisoner's dilemma. Everyone would be better off not getting plastic surgery and just accepting that.
Well, and another thing is
attractiveness is the baseline.
There's always outrage, especially when it comes to Korea, because this is the place where it happens the most. But a lot of guys want to see what their wife looked like before plastic surgery, or vice versa. But you don't see any stories of the vice versa, because the news media only cares about women being shamed for their looks. But basically, you're not going to be reading the right signals from their face about like genetic matchups that you should be in terms of attraction once plastic surgery is involved. And if you're planning on having kids with a person, like, it's totally reasonable to want to know what they looked like before plastic surgery.
There was that case in China where a man married a woman and she had pretty extensive plastic surgery and like made herself look very attractive, but her baseline was pretty bad. And then they had a kid, and the kid was so ugly that he dug into
her past,
into her past, and found out that she had plastic surgery and immediately divorced her.
Man, and like, people would think that's shallow, but it's like, you're not like, if you're planning on having kids, you're not selecting a mate that's gonna have unattractive kids with you for the exact reasons we're talking about here. You don't want your kid to be unattractive, because then they're gonna have disadvantages in life. Like, it's a fact. If you're just getting married for the sake of having a partner and not having kids, then like the argument would be totally different. But in terms of pass on to your offspring, it's like it messes with the return to monkey ability to understand what's going to happen in your future.
Well, that was it that I had for that. Unless you guys got a
well, I would just I guess kind of support your initial point, in the sense, I think plastic surgery has a place for people that are really just SOL in life and roll to one.
Yeah, and that's the basic point that I don't approve of all the butt implants and stuff like that. I do think that I would agree with a lot of the plastic surgery is frivolous and ridiculous. But I do think it has a place for those who really did roll a 1. And like the example of the person I knew at university, it was rough. I wouldn't, I don't know, being dealt that would have been a really shitty life, and she wouldn't fix it. And she's way better off. Cause I talked to her about it, and she's like, yeah, it was worth every penny. It has made my life so much better. You can't even imagine. It's okay. That's got to count for something.
I guess I'll take a stab at my second one, which I haven't really articulated it well in my own head, so probably won't be well articulated now. But basically, I was just thinking about this because of the recent Kanye stuff, which, if depending when you're listening,
I need a little refresher on
the recent Kanye stuff. For the Luddites in our audience, including
people who don't use Twitter.
You mean?
He basically got canceled on social media, and I think it was his bank was a Bank of America. I don't know. His bank told him he has to take all his money out by November, because they're mad, because he basically was saying anti-Semitic stuff about how Jews control.
Man, isn't the bank thing real though? Because man, you just know how it looks when you get your money kicked out of a bank because you were anti-Semitic. It's who runs the banks?
Well, it wasn't Kanye that said it, so that reported it. So I'm pretty sure it's real.
That's crazy.
I think it was the bank themselves that went public and said, we've told Kanye to get his shit out of our bank by November. And
they told him, God damn it, Kanye, you know who runs this bank.
What I guess my hot take of this the situation is like Kanye's attitude and his like claims are just an inevitable consequence of his of like the cultural zeitgeist right now towards like the conversation around like uh, rich people and power structure and all that kind of thing, especially in like the liberal elite university woke stuff, where the narrative and like I'd be shocked to hear any like one of these people act like dispute this, that their narrative is like billionaires and wealthy people don't deserve their wealth. They basically earn their wealth through exploitation and by uh, screwing over the working class and exploiting labor, and therefore they should be taxed into oblivion to redistribute that exploited wealth.
Well, and I
And
think also not just labor, because that's the classical Marxist, but like the neo-Marxists are obsessed with identity too, exploiting other racial groups or ethnic groups.
yeah, like that's true. Like the new twist to it is like, the wealthy also got that by, yes, utilizing racism and sexism to keep marginalized groups down and therefore steal their wealth, right? And then Kanye has the audacity to look around and be like, wow, there's a disproportionate amount of wealthy Jews. That's crazy. And it's like, he's not wrong. And like no Jew or no reasonable person will deny it. They are just, it's the stats are obvious. The wealthiest subset of Americans are people of Jewish background. That's just a fact. And if you, so it's just your conclusions based on that information come down to your priors on what that means. If you believe America is more or less a meritocratic society that rewards hard work and effort and moral virtue and working hard as an honest business person, then the fact that Jews are disproportionately successful is just like, it's just a badge of honor in their case, right? It's like, wow, they work really hard. They have like a culture of hard work and striving, and that they were therefore adequately rewarded with the fruits of their labor. If you have this postmodernist woke attitude of like, oh, the only way you become successful and get to the top is by stepping on the heads of disadvantaged minorities and exploiting the working class, well, then any group that is disproportionately successful must have done that, by their very logic, must have done that through disproportionately exploiting the vulnerable groups and in general playing power politics to unfairly get more than they deserve. So it's like the logic. I don't see a situation where you can observe the fact that Jews are disproportionately successful, and also hold this like ideology of like, success is not earned, it's stolen, and without like inevitably coming to anti-Semitic conclusions. And it's like, wow, Kanye did that and then said it, and then everyone's like, well, that's anti-Semitic. It's like, well, you just like everything that's been laid out in culture that we're supposed to believe, he's just following that the thread there, and you guys are surprised. Like, on the other hand, if you push back against these people and say, oh, society is meritocratic, that's the exact type of logic that would lead you to believe that Jews are just the hardest working and have a culture of striving in the and necessitates zero anti-Semitic claims or beliefs or ideas. It's just like,
well, you might be accused of being a little pro-Semitic, like you think
A Zionist, dirty Zionist.
They just have a positive culture of hard work and effort. Like, it's a little racist.
Yeah, so I don't know. I guess that's the summary of it is like, yeah, I can't blame Kanye for following
Leftist logic.
The leftist logic to its ultimate conclusion and deciding not to have cognitive dissonance and just ignore that. Like, it's not his fault.
He's
I think it's
he's just mentally sane enough to like not have that cognitive dissonance and then like follow the logic. And then get there and then not just shut it down. Just spouts off on Twitter about it. It's a perfect combination of mentally ill and sane.
Well,
in this particular case, I'm not sure though, because Kanye seems like the type that would also be heavily influenced by the Black Israelite movement.
He definitely does take some inspiration from that. But you know what's interesting is like the another person person in the Black community that had this exact same stuff happen to them was Nick Cannon, who's like the definition poster child for like woke, Hollywood rule follower. And he also was Black Israelite inspired, which I think is interesting, like, because again, Kanye, who's like been, tarred and feathered as Trump supporting, alt-right weirdo, and Nick Cannon, who is like, again, super, super woke. Both of these people have come to like similar ideological positions on this one particular issue. And I think it's because the underlying message that's been radiated in society for the last, it's been decades now, but especially ramped up in the last 5-10 years. And it's to me, it's no surprise that you see people who you'd think would be diametrically opposed on most ideological issues actually have tons in common on this one particular issue.
It is very explanatory, like when you put it like that, as to why the left is dealing with such an issue of anti-Semitism kind of bubbling up through the ranks. I think the most public example is the last British election. They had a bunch of anti-Semites in their Labour Party, and that became a big talking point.
Yeah, and I also think, like, beyond anti-Semitism, you also see it with any group that's disproportionately successful, right? And you've started seeing that in the U.S. with Asian Americans, right?
Yeah,
like,
there was quite a few attacks on Asians, and the big majority of the perpetrators were Black.
Well, and again, it's not. Yeah, like the logic there again, like Asians are disproportionately successful. That's just like a fact. You can go look up those stats on all those things. And it's like, well, if success is only gotten through exploitation, then they're exploiting. And
People
why
don't
wouldn't you
understand
be resentful towards them?
They're exploiting their children to work in their convenience stores for them. Come on, that's the original the way they all made their buck, right? It's the meme.
Yeah.
It's hardworking convenience store owners, the family run businesses.
Yeah, I don't think so many of these Harvard graduates are following the convenience store line, but maybe.
Yeah. Well, I just mean, like, I've actually seen that as, I don't know, business people complain because immigrants bring over family members or have big families, and then they get them to work in their business without paying them. And they're like, this isn't fair. I need to pay all my employees. And it's like, come on, man. Like, just have more kids and make them work for you. Easy.
Yeah, there is a
solution. Yeah, what's stopping you?
Too.
But yeah, it's on you here, man. I think the way God intended businesses to be run.
I think actually what you'll probably wind up seeing is on campus in the universities, a lot of resentment towards the Asians as they'll become, I think it's going to become more and more apparent that they're overrepresented. And I think that is going to actually...
Well, that's only if they're allowed to be overrepresented. They're having to sue some universities right now for limiting the number of Asians.
Yeah, but in the ones that don't do that, like, I think...
Well, they're still overrepresented even despite the limitations.
Yeah, and
True.
I think that is really going to start boiling over, right? At some point, because depending on the group. But yeah, if you are, because the campuses are a hotbed of this ideology, and there's got to be at least some students who will take it seriously and go out, like, draw it out all the way out to the logical conclusion. And I think you will start seeing a pretty big, I don't know exactly what, but a growing resentment towards particular groups like Jews and Asians, and on campus in particular, over the next few years, like as this carries on, unless something comes around and
I'd
knocks
be
it
as
down.
pessimistic as that, but it's definitely a possibility. But
I think it's a possibility for sure, but
I think it's like the Jewish one is the most obvious red flag because anti-Semitism has been a problem for the exact same reasons. Like they've been disproportionately successful for thousands of years.
yeah, exactly.
And
There's
it's
a
like
reason pogroms
it's a
have their own
recurring
name.
motif in Western society to when things go bad, you blame the Jews. It's like there were instances of kings back in the medieval days bring in Jewish populations with the knowledge that one day them or their descendants could then scapegoat the Jewish population if they really fucked up. like,
Oh, Jesus.
that's
That
one of the
is-
reasons they got ejected from so many countries in
That is some
medieval Europe.
diabolical planning.
Well, it's like you have this outgroup that's disproportionately successful, ready to go as a scapegoat. It's just crazy how people, real politic, I guess.
Yeah, so I guess that's all I wanted to throw in on that one. I don't know if you guys have any.
No, I think I'm good.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, Price.
So my next one is, I'll just phrase it and say it might not come out perfectly, but Ukraine is just going to be better off after this war, like barring some nukes getting deployed. I'll give that one caveat. Or Russia's got the reincarnation of Heinz Guderian, and they somehow blitz through and conquer all of Ukraine in the next month. But barring some miracle for Russia or miracle for Ukraine that results in them getting nuked, I think they'll be better off. And there's a few avenues. I think the biggest one is that as much as it's a Russian talking point that Ukraine doesn't have any history and they're not a real country, because that's not the case. They have plenty of history and that they are a real country. They weren't united in recent times in the way that a lot of nation states are. Like the nation state movement kind of flared up in Ukraine or after the First World War, and they had their own independence. And then the Soviets are like, no, you're coming back. And they never got a proper nation building experience. Like obviously they probably tried to implement one after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it clearly wasn't very successful because there were a lot of divisions resulting in the coup that occurred in 2014. But what this, I think, has to do, it'd be crazy if it didn't, is give a sense of nationhood to Ukraine, like the ability to defeat Russia and like a modern sense of nationhood, not trying to harken back to something in like the 1400s that your great ancestors would remember. So that's going to be a positive in terms of national identity as being the country that defeated Russia. And then the other thing will be resource wealth, because they recently discovered a bunch of natural gas and oil, which I think was a factor, to say the least, in Russia moving in. It was to prevent the exploitation of that natural resource wealth. And that if they hold out against Russia and don't lose most of the territories with the natural resources, which is questionable right now, I believe, because I think it is mostly in the east of Ukraine. So they may lose access to some of these natural resources, but they'll have a much easier time selling the idea of developing natural gas and oil, even in the face of all the climate plans that the rest of Europe has, because Russia has been so belligerent that Europe will realize the value of getting oil and natural gas from Ukraine, and it will be much easier to sway public opinion in support of that.
Yeah, I could see it being like, oh, these guys just got hammered. Like,
Well,
we should buy from them.
Yeah, like they need natural gas, they need or we need natural gas, they need jobs, they need investment. Like South Korea, going back to like the Korean War, like when South Korea lost the Korean War, they got, or they didn't lose, but got beat up and most of their cities destroyed. They got a ton of investment to refurbish all their infrastructure. I don't know how many years that actually took. I'd have to look more into it, but like the world would be more willing to work with Ukraine but at the same time, and this would be a further development out of that, would be there'll be more accountability in the sense that people will give more of a shit if the money is being wasted corruptly in Ukraine. But that's maybe the far end of idealism, is that it would help cut down on the corruption in Ukraine.
I don't think that's like very idealistic. I think that's actually very likely, like, because the whole world's attention will be on Ukraine and also on the Ukrainian recovery. Like, I just can't imagine like
It won't
there
be as
will
corrupt
be
as it was, I guess. Yeah. It's just
like
how far it goes, and like, will it reach like a European level of corruption or not? Like
that. Yeah, I think the level of corruption reduction is like going to be debatable, but I just I couldn't imagine that like it'll
as
stay.
bad as it was.
Yeah, exactly, as corrupt, because especially, and you also add into the fact that there's like corruption allegations in Ukraine were entangled with American politics. Like, there's going to be American media tracking Ukraine for the next decade, right? Like, they're just because of that American political connection. There's just going to be so much more interest in following, the threads, that it'll be harder to get away with it without it being exposed. I think
thinking of it, EU membership requires a lot of corruption crackdown. So that would be another incentive to actually get it done if the EU is serious about getting Ukraine in after this.
Well, I was going to say, like, I think I would strongly agree with you that like there's a good probability this turns out like very good for the Ukraine in the long run. But again, like it's still in flux, right? Like there's because, as you were saying about the natural resources, almost all of the natural resources are in, as far as I understand it, in terms of like the natural gas, especially, and other petroleum products, it's in the eastern part of Ukraine that's more or less under Russian occupation still.
Yeah, so, it's like I think the fields basically go from like where the front line is to the Russian border kind of area. If I remember correctly.
So I'm not up to date on all that, but I as far as I understand it, they would still need to like continue their military momentum and actually push Russia more or less out of most of the area that they're currently in to like reclaim those resource areas. And like the negotiated peace would need to include like Ukraine retaining like what is like Donbass and the other areas
Luhansk
there.
And
like
Donbass,
most of those areas would need to be retained by the Ukraine in the peace deal for that to play out the way you were describing, right? Which is, I think at this point, no guarantee, right? We don't really know what's going to happen. I think the other thing too is we don't know how much like commitment there will be by the West in terms of like dragging the Ukrainians back into, a recovered state, because it's going to take tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to rebuild everything, right? And whether or not there will be an appetite to do that, depending on like how and what the peace is negotiated. I don't know. I will say like I see a lot of scenarios where you're right, where this turns out very well for them, where they get a decent peace deal, they get their resource areas back. The West is very happy to invest in Ukraine and there's a lot more capital investment in Ukraine than there was before the war, and they get considered for EU membership and NATO membership, and they actually turn a corner. So, but I think there's still so much uncertainty about the outcome of the war that it's hard to say for sure what will happen.
Yeah, I've just hit the Ukraine copium real hard here with their recent successes, and it's like we'll see if Russia can stabilize. Like Putin, I guess, recently said that they're canceling not canceling, but their mobilization will be over in a week. Like they'll have achieved their number they wanted. But it's like, I don't know. You can't get good news that up to date about what's going on over there. But it just seems like there's good reason to be hopeful for Ukraine.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add to that. I think you both kind of covered
I guess the
my
only thing
thoughts.
to add is like the reason people hate war so much is the amount of deaths, but like the amount of deaths in this war has still been incredibly low for like in the context of modern warfare. Like you're looking at roughly 60 to 80,000 casualties, which means like probably 20 to 30,000 dead on each side and probably 20 to 30,000 maimed, like so that they'll be physically maimed. But it's just like compared to something like the Second World War, where you see how Japan and Germany bounced back after losing millions of deaths, it's really not that much.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the numbers. It seems like the numbers are like
Well,
very
like the
one of the
fact that
most unreliable portions of the war is like the casualty numbers because there's so much incentive for both sides
everyone
to
to lie,
lie. Yeah, so
but the
I
fact that
don't
we
know.
get news reports when 11 civilians die, like, well, obviously every civilian death is not a good thing and it's an individual tragedy. It's like, man, 11 civilians dying would not even be noteworthy in most historical wars. And that is mainstream news when that happens in Ukraine.
Yeah, that actually is rather surprising, right? Where you'd think
Well, I mean, like
a
the
lot of people.
USA in Pakistan was killing hundreds of people with drone strikes, and those never made the news because it's America. It's like they blow up a group of 11 guys hanging out because two of them were suspected terrorists, and the other nine were fighting age males, so they weren't considered civilians by the U.S. Like,
Yeah.
but yeah, that about wraps up all I want to say on that, I guess.
All right. Okay, we can do my last one. And mine is basically that recessions are good, and I hope we have one soon, sooner than later.
Filthy
And
libertarian.
I know I'm just a horrible human being.
Business cycles. I don't want to see any of that shit
Yeah,
in my lifetime.
I just like from working in the industry I did, and I'm seeing all of these companies that had like they were purely running on debt. They had no basically viable like business model essentially. Like I had multiple clients who were their total revenue even over the course of the life of the company, one was like $220 million in losses since inception, and it's just clearly run horribly, and they're just surviving on cheap debt and contributing literally nothing to the economy and just wasting huge amounts of time and money and resources. It's just I think we need a bit of a reset here, just because. And there's also just one of the big things I think that would be really nice to see is I think it'll cut a lot of like a nasty recession will cut a lot of the woke garbage out of companies. Um, I've already seen it. Companies have started paring away like their HR and their diversity, equity, inclusion garbage because they realize like, oh, this is not really contributing to our bottom line, like like we delusionally thought it would, and so we just got to axe
The
it.
other thing with that is the investors are souring on ESG. And so then it's like, why are we investing in ESG if investors don't care about it? Like that
Yeah,
was the
exactly.
biggest incentive for companies to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I just think it would really help to get at least a bit of a handle on the rampant like ideology that has taken over companies that is actually quite harmful because a lot of that diversity, equity, inclusion stuff turns out to be who would have thought, but usually pretty damaging to your company. Like if you're doing a bunch of diversity
Hmm.
hires, that just damages morale because people start realizing like, oh, people are only being hired based on their race or gender. They're not very good at their jobs, and now, but I can't say anything. It like, and I've seen this happen like within companies, and it really just it just can completely poison the company culture, and it would be a good thing, I think, for, and the ESG stuff is, I think, even worse in lots of ways. So it would be though ESG does encompass like diversity, equity, inclusion as well. Technically, it does
Well,
fall
that's
under the
one of the
umbrella.
biggest things that they care about, because that's why Tesla doesn't make it onto the top 100 ESG companies, even though they're doing the most to make the world a greener place, probably out of every company. They just don't have enough social governance.
Yeah, exactly. Which is hilarious. It's Musk was concerned about climate change long before anybody started talking about it in the mainstream. I read his autobiography, and he was thinking about it when he was in college all the time, and so that would have been probably in the 90s, I think it was. And so it just the guy that's been obsessed about climate change and viewing it as one of the biggest risks to humanity is his companies are penalized over because they're not doing enough for representation. And so I think a good proper recession to one, just cut out a lot of the companies that are doing absolutely nothing, wasting, like they're just huge wastes of resources and manpower that should be spent elsewhere, would be good. And paring back all of this ridiculous ideology that has infected the companies. Like I know companies now are going into recession planning. That's pretty common across the board. And I know of the companies that I know of, they're actually like axing their divisions, like their ESG stuff. Like they are paring that back pretty hard. So, like already starting to see that. So it would be nice to have a proper reset and a good one. That's just.
I think in economic terms, there's a couple things there, which is like zombie companies, which is what you're describing in terms of companies that only survive because of cheap debt. And they're just a problem because they take up otherwise, productive assets that are being allocated to companies that just shouldn't exist. And that like leads to the broader thing of like malinvestment, where the fact, like when times are good and interest rates are low and there's lots of cheap money everywhere, you can be incentivized to just invest in pretty much anything because there's no risk that you'll lose your money basically if there's 0% interest rates, and companies that should go bankrupt don't go bankrupt, so you can invest them and not lose your money. And so you end up investing in things that don't actually provide future productivity. And if that goes on long enough, you basically hollow out your economy because you keep, there is only so much work to go around. There is only so much capital to go around. There is only so much natural resources to go around. And if it's being put into things that aren't going to actually lead to maximally efficient productivity in the long term, your economy starts to hollow out and become less effective and less efficient and grow slower and even lose its ability to grow eventually. And that's generally why the business cycle exists, is because humans don't learn the lesson ever. And it's new people making new decisions as well, right? Like you think, oh well, why didn't company XYZ learn from the last time that there was a business downturn and save for the rainy day or whatever? It's like, because company XYZ was run by a whole different set of managers 15 years ago, because after 15 years that whole all those managers have moved on, and it's different people making different decisions, and they have to learn the same lesson that their predecessors learned the last time around. So that's why it's cyclical, and that's why it needs to be cyclical, and we just haven't we don't have any good way around like smoothing out our economy enough that you can't have some degree of like recession and then over exuberance. Like we don't have the ability to do that yet. And every time we like the past experiences told us, like when we try to like get rid of the highs and lows, you just end up exacerbating the problem by kicking the can down and making the inevitability even more extreme, because you just delayed it, and the problems built up even more than they would have if you would just let it naturally run its course.
Yeah. And I think like when you look into this stuff, most people agree with that. And then it's like, even though most people agree with it in principle, there's always something going on. And it's like, oh, we can't afford to have the problems right now. So we'll kick the
Yeah.
can just this once. But that happens
Yeah.
every single time it's possible to kick the can.
That's such a good point. Like,
It's like, oh,
there's
man,
always
okay,
another reason. It's
it's
always
bad
like,
to kick the can, but we need to this one time.
yeah, I promise it is just like just one last cigarette or just one last drink or just,
One last midterm election.
yeah,
And then
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, I just basically want to see some a proper shakeup instead of like just the continuation down the same shitty path that we're on. Just watching all of the zombie companies that I had to deal with and all of the crazy like ideology and just also like a lot of the like yeah mismanagement of resources. I think it's time for a real proper hard reset. And I say that as somebody whose current job is, well within the realm of being axed because I work for like luxury products. And that's like one of the first things to go. And so, but I accept that risk and still hope it happens. Like, and it's not to, punish everybody and say like, I don't care about like recessions are really rough on people, but I think it's one of those things where it's, you have to rip the Band-Aid off. Otherwise, you're going to be slowly pulling it off for years. And that's going to be so much worse than just having a proper reset. Like the consequences of kicking the can down the road. Yeah. Like you guys already said, it's just so much worse. So bring it on, boys. Let's fucking ready to go.
I don't know. I think we can kick the can at least another couple decades until I'm ready to retire, right?
Just what you want, the collapse right as you retire.
Yeah, when you're going to pull out your convert your
No, that's why you have kids, then you just go live with your kids because you can't pull out your RSPs.
The true dream. Just live on the kids.
What else are kids for?
Working in convenience stores and leeching off of later on in life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they made a lot of money off you working in your convenience store.
The all $0 an hour that you paid them. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it for me, though. Unless you guys got anything else, I think color done.
I think that's about it for me too.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening.